Aloha and welcome back to the Siren Circle. I'm Alicia Marie and I am so glad that you are here for episode 7. We are in early April now. Spring is in full swing. The seeds are sprouting, everything is growing, blooming, and coming back to life. There is so much more light, newness, and forward momentum. And today we are going to talk about the other side, the shadow, the darkness, the parts of yourself that aren't blooming in the light, the parts that might be hiding, lurking, or operating behind the scenes. We are doing a deep dive on shadow work. Now, shadow work has become kind of a buzzword in the spiritual circles. People throw it around all the time. Oh, I'm going to do my shadow work, or that's just your shadow showing up, or you need to work on your shadow. But here's the thing, most people don't actually know what shadow work is. They don't know how to do it. They just know it sounds deep and spiritual and like something that they should be doing. So today we're going to go beyond the buzzword. We are going to talk about what shadow work actually is, where it comes from, why it matters, and how to actually do it in a way that is safe, sustainable, and transformative. This episode might get a little bit uncomfortable, so just want to be transparent and real with you. Shadow work isn't light and it's definitely not fluffy. It is not all crystals and good vibes and positive energy. It is about looking at the parts of yourself that you've been avoiding, parts that you have rejected, and maybe parts that you've hidden away because you were told they were too much, not enough, or just plain wrong. And it is a little bit hard. It's vulnerable and it can get a little bit messy. But it's also some of the most important work that you can do because you can't heal what you won't acknowledge. You can't integrate what you've been pushing away. And you can't become whole if you're only willing to look at half of yourself. So, today we are going to talk about what shadow work actually is, the real definition, not the Instagram version. We're going to explore what lives in your shadow and how it shows up in your life. We're going to talk about integration versus spiritual bypassing because there is a big difference between actually doing the work and just pretending that you're healed. We are going to walk through how to start working with your shadow in a safe, compassionate way. And we're going to give you some practical tools between journal prompts, practices, and rituals that you can actually use. This is not a theory. This is very much real. It's applicable, life-changing. And if you are ready to go there, I am here to guide you through it. But also, if this episode brings up stuff for you, if it feels like it's too much, please be gentle with yourself. Shadow work is not a race. You do not have to do it all at once. And some shadow work requires professional support, a therapist, a counselor, or someone trained in trauma work. There is no shame in that. In fact, that's powerful and full of wisdom. So take what serves you from this episode and leave the rest. Trust yourself to know what you are ready for. Before we fully dive in, I do want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by the Magic Siren. If you are looking for personalized guidance as you navigate your own shadow work, your spiritual path, or any crossroads in your life, you can find me at themagicsiren.com for tarot readings, birth chart readings, and other spiritual services. And as always, the listeners of the Siren Circle can enjoy 10% off any service using the code SIRENSCIRCLE at checkout. All right, now let's get into it. Let's talk about the shadow. The term shadow comes from Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who founded analytical psychology. Jung introduced the concept of shadow in the early 20th century as part of his work on the human psyche. Jung believed that the psyche, the totality of your mind and soul, is made up of different parts. You have the conscious mind, which is what you're aware of, and you have the unconscious mind, which contains everything that you're not aware of, but that still influences your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Within the unconscious, Jung identified something that he called the shadow. And the shadow, according to Jung, is the part of yourself that you've repressed, denied, or hidden away. It's the parts of you that you don't want to see, don't want to acknowledge, or don't want any other people to know about. Jung said, and I quote, Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. End quote. In other words, the more you ignore your shadow, the more power it has over you. So let's get really clear on this. The shadow is not some evil part of you. It is not a demon that you need to exorcise. It's not proof that you are broken or bad. The shadow is simply the parts of yourself that you've rejected, denied, or hidden. These are the parts of you that you were taught were unacceptable, the parts that got you punished, shamed, rejected, or abandoned when you expressed them, the parts that you learned to suppress in order to survive, to be loved, to fit in, and to be safe. Maybe you were told that anger was bad, so you pushed down your anger and now it lives in your shadow. Maybe you were told you were too loud, too emotional, too sensitive, so you learned to be small and quiet. And your bigness, your fire or your flame, your expressiveness went into the shadow. Maybe you were told that wanting attention was selfish, so you suppressed your desire to be seen, and now you struggle to take up space or claim your accomplishments. Maybe you learned that being vulnerable was weak, so you armored up, and your softness, your need for connection, your tenderness, all of that went into the shadow. The shadow contains everything that you've disowned about yourself in order to be acceptable, lovable, and safe. And there's something really important that people often miss. The shadow doesn't just contain the bad parts of you. It also contains disowned gifts, strengths, and light. Sometimes you hide your power because it threatens other people. Sometimes you hide your intelligence because you were told not to outshine others. Sometimes you hide your beauty, your creativity, or your confidence because it wasn't safe to be that radiant. So the shadow can include your anger, your rage, or darkness, but also your power, your confidence, or your radiance. It can include your shame, your fear, or your unworthiness, but also your desires, your needs, or your worthiness. It could also have your jealousy, your pettiness, or your selfishness, but also including your ambition, your boundaries, and your self-advocacy. The shadow is anything that you've been taught is too much or not enough. Anything that you have learned to hide. So why do we do this? Why do we create a shadow in the first place? Well, because we have to, because we're human, because we're raised in families and cultures and societies that have rules, spoken and unspoken, about what's acceptable and what's not. When you're a child, your survival depends on being loved and accepted by your caregivers. So if expressing a certain part of yourself gets you rejected, punished, or shamed, you learn really quickly to stop expressing that part. You push it down, you hide it, you disown it. And that's not necessarily weakness, that's adaptation. That is part of your survival. We also absorb messages from our culture about what's acceptable. Gender norms, racial dynamics, class expectations, religious conditioning. All of these things shape what parts of yourself you are allowed to express and what parts you have to hide. And trauma creates shadows too. When something painful happens and you don't have the support to process it, that pain goes into the shadow. It gets buried and it stays there, influencing you from the unconscious. The creation of the shadow is not your fault. It is natural. It is a human response to the environment that you grew up in. But as an adult, you have the power to reclaim what was lost. And that's what shadow work is about. Now, here's the thing about the shadow. Just because you're not aware of it doesn't mean that it's not affecting you. In fact, the shadow has more power over you when it's unconscious than when it's conscious. Your shadow influences your life from behind the scenes. It influences your decisions, your relationships, self-sabotage, your patterns, your triggers, all without you realizing it. Jung said, quote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Unquote. That's shadow work, making the unconscious conscious, bringing what's hidden into the light so you can see it, understand it, and integrate it. When the shadow is unconscious, it can control you. When you bring it into awareness, you have a choice about how to work with it. So I want to clear up a couple of common misconceptions because there is a lot of confusion out there when it comes to shadow work. The first misconception: shadow work is just journaling about your feelings. Shadow work can include journaling, of course, but it is so much deeper than that. It's about uncovering unconscious patterns, facing what you've been avoiding, and integrating disowned parts of yourself into your life. It is deep psychological and spiritual work. The second misconception is shadow work is only about the dark stuff. As we talked about, the shadow also includes your disowned light, your power, your gifts, your brilliance. Shadow work is about reclaiming all of it. The third misconception is shadow work is a one-time thing. Shadow work is ongoing. You don't do shadow work once and then you're done. The shadow is layered. As you heal one layer, another reveals itself. This is a lifelong process and work. The fourth misconception is if you are spiritual, you shouldn't have a shadow. Everybody has a shadow, everyone. No amount of meditation, yoga, or spiritual practice is going to make you immune to the shadow. In fact, spiritual people often have the biggest blind spots because they think that they are above the shadow. And the fifth misconception is that shadow work means dwelling in darkness. Shadow work is not about wallowing or staying stuck in pain. It is about acknowledging the darkness so that you can integrate it and move forward with more wholeness. It is a path towards healing, not a destination of suffering. Now, I also have to be clear on this. Shadow work and therapy are not the same thing, though they can absolutely work together. Therapy, especially trauma-informed therapy, provides a safe, professional container for processing pain, healing wounds, and developing new patterns. If you have significant trauma, complex mental health issues, or if shadow work is bringing up things that feel too big to handle on your own, please work with a trained therapist. Shadow work can also be done on your own or with spiritual guides, but it is not a replacement for professional mental health support when that is what might be needed. That being said, shadow work and therapy complement each other beautifully. Therapy can help you process trauma and develop coping skills, while shadow work can help you integrate what you've uncovered in therapy and reclaim your wholeness. So why does this matter? Why should you care about your shadow? Well, because you can't heal what you don't acknowledge. Because the parts of yourself that you reject don't go away. They just operate from the unconscious, sabotaging you, triggering you, and repeating the same patterns over and over again. Because true wholeness requires integrating all of yourself, not just the parts that you deem acceptable. And because your shadow holds power. And when you reclaim that power, when you integrate it, you become more whole, more authentic, and more free. Shadow work is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming real. It is about owning all of who you are, the light and the dark, the beautiful and the messy, the acceptable and the rejected. And when you do that, when you stop running from yourself, everything starts to change. So that's what shadow work is. It is the process of bringing the unconscious into consciousness, of reclaiming the parts of yourself that you've disowned, of integrating the rejected pieces so that you can become whole. All right, so now that we know what the shadow is, let's get into the anatomy of it. What actually lives in there? And how does it show up in your day to day life? Because your shadow is not abstract, it is not some philosophical concept floating around in the ether. It is showing up in your life right now, in your relationships, in your reactions, in the patterns that you can't seem to break, in the way that you talk to yourself when no one's listening. So let's start by looking at what's actually inside of the shadow. The first thing that lives in the shadow is repressed emotions. These are the feelings that you were taught not to have, not to show, or not to express. Anger is a huge one. So many of us, especially women, we are told that anger was unladylike, dangerous, or destructive. So we pushed it down. We smiled when we were furious. We said, I'm fine when we were angry. And that anger didn't disappear. It went underground. Grief is another one. Sadness. We live in a culture that worships being productive and staying positive. So sitting with grief can feel almost wrong. So we push it down and we keep moving. Shame, jealousy, fear, loneliness, all of these emotions that we were taught were bad or weak or too much, they all find a home in the shadow. The second category is rejected parts of ourselves. These are the personality traits, the ways of being, the aspects of your character that we're told were unacceptable. Maybe you were a loud, excited kid and you were told to be quiet so many times that you learned to shrink. Maybe you were deeply sensitive and you were told to toughen up, so you armored yourself and your tenderness went into hiding. Maybe you were very independent and you were told that that was selfish, so you learned to put everyone and everything else first and forgot how to advocate for yourself. Whatever parts of you got punished, rejected, or shamed, those parts are probably in your shadow. Third, we have disowned desires and needs. This is a big one. Our needs and desires are so core to who we are. And yet, so many of us learned early on that having needs was a burden, that wanting things was selfish, that desiring more than what we were given was being ungrateful. So we learned not to want, or at least to pretend like we didn't. But those desires didn't go away. They're in the shadow, driving behaviors in ways that we don't fully understand. Fourth is the unconscious beliefs and patterns. Your shadow holds beliefs that you absorbed throughout your entire life. You're not good enough. You are too much. Love isn't safe. You have to earn your worth. The world isn't a safe space for people like you. These beliefs live beneath the surface and run on autopilot. It shapes how we see ourselves, how we move through the world, and what we allow ourselves to have. And fifth, and honestly, this one surprises a lot of people, is disowned gifts and strengths. Your shadow doesn't just hold darkness, it holds buried light too. Maybe you were told that you were showing off when you shared your accomplishments. So you learned to downplay your abilities, and now you can't receive a compliment without deflecting. Maybe you were punished for being too confident or too bold or even too radiant. So that power went underground and now it might scare you a little bit. Your shadow might be holding the most magnificent parts of you, just waiting to be reclaimed. Okay, so with this in mind, let's talk about how all of this actually shows up, because this is where it gets really interesting. The number one way that your shadow shows up is through triggers. When something, whether it's a comment, a situation, or a person, produces a reaction that feels unequal to what's actually happening, that is your shadow knocking. That hot flash of rage when somebody interrupts you, the crushing spiral of shame over a minor mistake, or the deep irrational fear that someone might leave, or even when an emotional response doesn't match the actual situation, there's almost always shadow material underneath. Your triggers are not random. They are your shadow saying, here, take a look at this. Your shadow also shows up through repeating patterns. If you keep finding yourself in the same kinds of relationships, the same kinds of conflicts, the same kinds of dead ends, that might not necessarily be bad luck. That is your shadow at work. The unconscious has a funny way of recreating cycles until you become conscious of them and choose something different. This is why you can know intellectually that a pattern is harmful, but still find yourself repeating it. Because knowing isn't enough. You have to go into the shadow and address the root. Then there's self-sabotage. You're on the verge of something good, whether it's a new relationship, a creative project, a new big opportunity, and suddenly you blow it. You pull back, you start drama, you procrastinate until it's too late, you unconsciously destroy the very thing that you wanted. Self-sabotage is also your shadow, protecting you from something that it believes is dangerous. Getting too visible, succeeding and being judged, being loved and then abandoned. Your shadow is trying to keep you safe, just in ways that are no longer serving you. And then there's projection. And this one is gold for shadow work. Projection is when you take something that is actually inside of you and you see it outside of you in someone else. Jung actually said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us into an understanding of ourselves. So when you have a strong, almost automatic negative reaction to someone, when you find yourself judging them intensely or dismissing them or obsessing over their flaws or problems, that's often projection. That quality you can't stand in them, there is a good chance it's something that you have rejected in yourself. Now, that doesn't mean you have to like everybody, but when the reaction is intense and charged, it is worth asking yourself, where do I do this? Where does this live in me? The same is true in reverse, by the way. Sometimes what you deeply admire about someone else is a quality that you've disowned in yourself. The person who you put on a pedestal might just be modeling something that your shadow is wanting to reclaim. And finally, relationships themselves function as mirrors. The people in your life, your partners, your families, your closest friends, your communities, they often reflect back to you the aspects of yourself that your shadow is carrying. Relationships are one of the fastest, most confrontational, and most effective vehicles for shadow work that exist, because other people will activate your shadow in ways that nothing else can. I actually want to share a moment of my own shadow work with you because I think it will maybe land a little bit stronger than any theory that I could give you. For a really long time, I had a really complicated relationship with my father's anger. Growing up, his anger was something that I really disliked. It felt big, unpredictable, and extremely overwhelming. And I made a decision somewhere along the way, probably without even really realizing that I was baking it, that I was not going to be like that. I was not going to be an angry person. That just was not going to be me. And I genuinely believed that for years. But the thing about the shadow is that it doesn't necessarily care what you've decided about yourself. I started noticing little flashes of rage that felt way too intense for the situations that I was in, or a sharpness in my voice that I didn't really recognize. Sometimes it was a reaction that would come out of nowhere, and then I would end up sitting there asking myself, like, where did that come from? Feeling embarrassed. And then one day it hit me, like a wall. I was in a moment of real anger, and I caught a glimpse of myself, and I saw my father. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that I was destined to repeat everything that I had experienced, but in a very human way of realizing this is in me too. This lives here. And honestly, my first reaction was shame and embarrassment because I had spent so long making myself the opposite of that. And here it was anyway, in my own body, in my own voice. But then something else happened, something a little bit softer. Because once I actually saw it, once I stopped pretending that the anger wasn't there, I could start to get a little curious about it. Where did it come from? What was it protecting? What did it need? And that was the beginning of something for me. That was the moment that I stopped running from that part of myself. And it was the moment that I could actually start healing it. And I think that's the thing about shadow work that nobody tells you. You don't heal the parts of yourself that you keep at arm's length. You heal them by getting close, by looking directly at them, by saying, okay, I see you. You are a part of me, whether I like it or not, and I am willing to work with you. I am willing to start healing this. And that's where the healing really begins. I'm only sharing that with you because I know that I'm not alone. And if any of what I described sounds familiar, if you recognize your triggers, your patterns, your projections, and what I'm talking about, you're not broken. You are not damaged. You are just human. We all have a shadow, every single one of us. The question is not whether you have one. The question is whether you are willing to look at it. Which brings us to the part that I think is most important and the most misunderstood. We need to talk about the difference between actually integrating your shadow and spiritually bypassing it, because they can look really similar from the outside, but they are fundamentally and completely different things. And I feel like this conversation in spiritual spaces right now is skipped and definitely overlooked. So let's start with integration, because it is another one of those words that gets thrown around with not a lot of explanation on what it is. So integration is not about becoming a perfectly healed, fully enlightened version of yourself who never gets triggered and always responds with grace and positivity and wisdom. That is not integration. That is a fantasy. Integration is about acknowledging the shadow without identifying with it. It is the difference between saying, I am my anger, and saying, I have anger and I'm learning to understand it. You are not becoming your shadow. You are becoming aware of it. Integration is about bringing unconscious material into conscious awareness. Remember what Jung said. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Integration is the process of shining a light on what's been operating in the dark. Not to destroy it, not to fix it, just to see it. Integration is about accepting all parts of yourself without judgment. And I do want to be very clear about this and what that means, because acceptance gets misunderstood. Accepting your shadow doesn't mean approving of every behavior that comes from it. It doesn't mean letting yourself off the hook for harm that you may have caused. It means acknowledging that these parts exist, that they developed for a reason, and that they deserve to be understood rather than condemned. Integration is about reclaiming your wholeness. Remember how we talked about the shadow holding your disowned gifts too? Integration means getting those back, reclaiming your power, your voice, your fire, the parts of you that were buried because it wasn't safe to have them. And maybe most importantly, integration is ongoing. It is not a destination. You don't do the work, reach integration, and then you're done. The shadow is layered. As you heal one level, another one will reveal itself. It is a lifelong process, and the goal is not to finish. The goal is to keep going. Now, let's talk about the bypassing, because this is where I think a lot of well-meaning, genuinely spiritual people end up getting lost. Spiritual bypassing is a term that was coined by a psychologist, John Wellwood, in the 1980s, and it refers to using spiritual ideas, practices, or beliefs to avoid dealing with unresolved emotional wounds, psychological issues, or the harder parts of being a human. In other words, using spirituality to skip the work. And it's everywhere right now, especially on social media, especially in wellness and spiritual spaces. This is what it looks like. It looks like love and light only. The refusal to acknowledge anything dark, painful, or difficult. The insistence that everything is beautiful and everything happens for a reason and we should only focus on the positive. There's nothing wrong with seeking light. But when the pursuit of light becomes a way to avoid looking in the darkness, that is bypassing. It looks like toxic positivity. Just raise your vibration. Your thoughts create your reality. So think better thoughts. Everything is a blessing. These phrases aren't inherently wrong, okay? I'm not saying that they're wrong. But when they're used to shut down someone's pain, including your own, they become a bypass. You can't positive think your way out of unresolved trauma. You can't manifest your way around shadow work. It also looks like using spirituality to avoid feelings or responsibility, meditating instead of having a hard conversation, pulling tarot cards instead of making a decision, calling something a spiritual attack when really it's a pattern that maybe we have created. Blaming Mercury retrograde instead of looking at your own behavior, which we did a whole episode on Mercury retrograde already. And look, I am going to say this as somebody who loves tarot, who loves astrology, who deeply believes in spiritual practices. These tools are so powerful, but they can also become hiding places if we are not careful, as anything in life, balance is key. Bypassing can also look like jumping to forgiveness before processing pain. This one is subtle, but it's really common. And for those of you that watch me live on TikTok, you already know that I say not everyone deserves forgiveness in that moment. If someone hurts you, and instead of allowing yourself to feel the anger, the grief, the betrayal, you just rush to forgive them, because forgiveness feels spiritual, it feels evolved, it feels like the right thing to do. But forgiveness that hasn't been earned through genuine processing really is not forgiveness. It is suppressing with a spiritual label of forgiveness on it. Real forgiveness comes after you've actually felt what happened and not before. And then there is bypassing your humanity in the pursuit of enlightenment. The idea that being spiritual means transcending your human experience, your emotions, your needs, your desires, your messiness. The goal is to be so enlightened that nothing touches you, so detached that nothing hurts. But that's not enlightenment, that's just dissociation, and it's one of the most seductive traps in the spiritual culture. So beware. So let me draw some contrasts here very clearly for you. Bypassing avoids, while integration embraces. Bypassing suppresses, while integration releases. Bypassing stays on the surface, while integration goes deep. Bypassing says, I'm healed, when really it means I'm hiding. While integration says, I'm still in work, and that's okay. Bypassing uses spiritual language to avoid accountability, while integration uses spiritual practice as a genuine tool for growth. And one more thing that I do want to talk about before I move on. Bypassing is not a character flaw. It is not evidence that you are a fake spiritual person or that you are doing something wrong. Bypassing is tempting because the shadow is painful. Looking at the parts of yourself that you have rejected, sitting with emotions that you spent years avoiding, or facing patterns that you have ignored, that is hard. It is genuinely hard. And if someone offers you a belief system that says you don't have to do that, that you can just raise your vibration instead, or that you could just focus on the light and the darkness will fade, of course that's appealing. Of course it is. We bypass because feeling the feelings can feel like too much. But that's because we don't have the tools to go into the shadow safely. It's because that we were never taught that the darkness was survivable. Somewhere along the way, we got a message that our pain was too big, too much, or just too inconvenient. Bypassing does make sense, but it's just not working. And eventually, the shadow will find a way to make itself known whether you are ready or not. So now that we've understood what shadow work actually is, what lives in the shadow, and the difference between integrating and bypassing it, let's get into the part that you've probably been waiting for, because this is where we get practical. The shadow work can sound really abstract and a little bit overwhelming, and I think one of the reasons that people avoid it is that they genuinely don't know where to start. So let's go ahead and break it down. I'm going to walk you through 5 steps for beginning to work with your shadow. And I do want to be clear here, these aren't 5 steps that you do all at once and then you're done. These are just sort of orientations. It's ways of approaching shadow work that you can come back to again and again at different layers as your practice and work deepens. So let's start at the very beginning. The first step is the simplest as well as the hardest. It's radical and raw honesty. Shadow work cannot begin without honesty. And I don't mean the kind of honesty where you tell other people the truth. I mean the kind of honesty where you tell yourself the truth, where you're willing to look at your patterns, your behaviors, and your reactions without immediately justifying them, explaining them away, or making yourself the victim of any of them. This is genuinely hard because the ego is incredibly creative when it comes to protecting itself. It will find 1,000 reasons why your behavior was justified, why the other person was worse, or why the pattern isn't really a pattern. Radical and raw honesty means that you are willing to look past all of that, not to beat yourself up. Okay, we get to compassion here in just a minute, but to actually see what's there. Start paying attention to your triggers. When you have a strong emotional reaction, instead of just riding it or suppressing it, get curious. Ask yourself, what just happened inside of me? What story did I tell myself? Or what does this remind me of? Start noticing your patterns, not just in romantic relationships, but in all of your relationships. Your relationships with work, with money, with your body, with your creativity. Where do you keep arriving at the same destination, just from different routes? And start paying attention to what you avoid. What conversations do you consistently put off? What feelings do you immediately try to fix or escape from? What topics make you want to change the subject even in your own mind? The things that you avoid are often pointing directly at your shadow. And you don't need to fix anything in this step. You just need to be willing to see it. Now, before you go diving into the deep end of your shadow, you need to create safety. Shadow work without a safe container is not healing. It can cause traumatization, and that is not what we're here for. So what does a safe container look like? Well, it's going to be different for everyone, but here are a few things to consider. First, grounding practices. Before you sit down to do any shadow work, whether it's journaling, meditation, dialogue work, whatever it is, you want to ground yourself first. Get into your body, feel your feet on the floor, take some slow, deep breaths, maybe go outside and put your hands on something solid. Grounding reminds your nervous system that you are safe in the present moment, even as you're exploring difficult material or emotions from the past. Second is pacing yourself. Shadow work is not a sprint. You don't need to unpack every wound in one sitting. In fact, trying to go too deep too fast can be destabilizing and re-traumatizing. Think of it like physical exercise. You build the capacity gradually. You don't walk into a gym for the first time and try to lift the heaviest weight in the room. Go slow, take breaths, and let yourself integrate between sessions. Give yourself time to level out before going deeper. Third, and I cannot stress this enough, know when to seek support. Shadow work can bring up things that are bigger than what you should be holding alone. If you have significant trauma in your history, if shadow work is bringing up memories or emotions that feel overwhelming or destabilizing, please reach out to a professional. A trauma-informed therapist or a licensed counselor, just someone who is trained to hold that space safely. There is absolutely no shame in that. Doing shadow work alongside a professional is often the most effective and sustainable approach. You are not weak for needing support, you're being wise, and you're being smart. And beyond professional support, trusted friends, spiritual communities, a mentor, or a guide, having people around you who can process things with you, who know what you are moving through, really makes this work so much more sustainable. You are not meant to do this alone. This is the step that changes everything. And it's the step that is the most easy to skip over when you are eager to just fix it and move on. Before you can integrate your shadow, you have to learn to meet it with compassion. This is what I mean. When you start looking at your shadow, when you start seeing the anger, jealousy, self-sabotage, patterns that maybe you're not proud of, the instinct is often to judge it, to feel shame about it, to say, I can't believe that I'm like this, or I need to fix this immediately. But judgment doesn't heal the shadow. It will only drive it deeper. What actually moves shadow is curiosity and compassion, getting genuinely interested in why this part of you exists, understanding that your shadow developed to protect you, that the anger was a defense when you felt powerless, that the self-sabotage was keeping you safe from a risk that felt unsafe or unsurvivable. Every part of your shadow made sense at some point. Every single part of it. It developed in response to something real, whether it was a wound, a threat, a need that wasn't being met. It was doing its best with what it had. That doesn't mean that you let it run the show forever, but it does mean that you approach it with understanding instead of judgment or embarrassment. Think of it this way. Imagine a child who learned to throw tantrums because that was the only way that they would get their needs met. You wouldn't scream at that child for being manipulative. You would understand that they were just doing what worked, and you would gently and patiently teach them a new way. Your shadow is like that child. It learned what it needed because it had to. Your job is not to punish it. Your job is to understand it and then gradually and gently show it something different. Self-compassion is not optional when it comes to shadow work. That is part of the work. Okay, so now we get into the actual tools. Once you've established honesty and safety and some compassion as your foundation, you can start working with specific shadow aspects directly. The first and most accessible tool is journaling. And I don't mean stream of conscious journaling where you just kind of vent about your day. I mean intentional, directed journaling where you are asking specific questions designed to illuminate your shadow. I'm going to give you a full set of prompts in the next part of this podcast, so we will go deeper on that in just a moment. But for now, just know that journaling is one of the most powerful tools available to you because writing has a way of bringing things to the surface that ordinary thinking might keep buried. The second tool is dialogue work. This is where you actually have a conversation with your shadow part. I know that that might sound a little bit strange or a little bit wild, but stay with me here. The idea is that different parts of you have different voices, different needs, different perspectives. And instead of trying to silence the shadow parts, you can actually engage them in dialogue. You can write it out, literally writing back and forth between yourself and shadow, or asking it questions and just letting it respond within you. What would you ask it? Maybe things like, what are you trying to protect me from? Or what do you need? Or what happened that made you feel this way? Or maybe even what would help you feel safe enough to soften again? You might be surprised what comes up when you actually give your shadow a voice instead of trying to shut it out. The third tool is inner child work. So much of what lives in our shadow was put there during our childhood. The beliefs that we've absorbed, the parts of ourselves that we learned to hide, the wounds that we couldn't really process, so much of that happened before we even had the understanding of what was happening. Inner child work involves making contact with the younger version of you who is still carrying those experiences and that energy. You can offer your inner child the understanding or the validation, even the love that they needed and didn't receive. This can be done through journaling, through visualization, through therapy, or even just through creative expressions. It's tender work, so be gentle with yourself. And the fourth tool is parts work. This is inspired by the internal family systems model developed by Richard Schwartz. The IFS is based on the idea that the psyche is made up of multiple parts, each with their own role, their own fears, and their own ways of trying to help you survive. Some parts are protectors. They work hard to keep you safe, often in ways that aren't serving you anymore. Some parts are exiles, the wounded, the vulnerable parts that the protectors are working so hard to keep hidden. Shadow work and parts work go hand in hand beautifully. You don't have to go deep into the formal IFS practice to use the basic frameworks. Just starting to relate to your inner experiences as parts rather than the totality of who you are can be genuinely transformative. It creates a little bit of distance, a little bit of perspective, and that makes the shadow feel a little less overwhelming and more workable. Now, the final step is integration, and this is what we were talking about earlier. This is where we've taken what we've uncovered in our shadow work and weaving it into our actual life, letting it change you, letting it become part of who you are consciously rather than continuing to run things from the background. The first integration practice is somatic and embodiment work. The shadow lives not just in our mind, but also in our body. Traumas, repressed emotions, and disowned experiences are stored in our nervous system. It's in our muscles, it's in our breath. So integration has to include the body. This can look different for everyone. It might be yoga or dance or breath work, or simply just placing your hand on your heart and breathing into a different feeling instead of pushing it away. It might be working with somatic therapy as well. The second integration practice is creative expression. This one's my favorite. There's art, writing, music, movement. These are just some of the oldest and most effective tools for processing and integrating shadow material. But when something feels too big for words, sometimes you just need to paint it or dance it out or maybe write it as a poem. Don't edit yourself in this. Don't try to make it good. Just let it be raw and imperfect and exactly what it needs to be. The third practice is ritual. Ritual has a way of making internal experiences feel real and significant. Some people find it powerful to write down a shadow aspect. Maybe it's a belief that they're releasing or a shame that they're letting go of, and burn it. Others create a reclaiming ceremony to welcome back a disowned part of themselves. You might create a small altar or a meditation ritual or a regular practice of just sitting with your shadow in an intentional way. Ritual is not always just about magic for magic's sake. It's about giving your psyche a container, a symbol, or just something that marks something real that is shifting internally. And finally, bringing it into your relationships. Integration isn't just something that happens in your journal or in your meditations. It happens in real time. In the moments that you catch yourself mid-reaction and you make a different choice, when you notice a projection and you pull it back, or when you feel the shadow rising and instead of suppressing it or acting it out, you pause, you breathe, and you ask yourself, what is this part of me needing right now? These are the moments when integration actually happens. It's not these dramatic breakthroughs, but in the quiet, consistent choices to keep showing up for yourself. I want to say one more thing before we move into the prompts and the practices section, and it's this. This work is not linear. You will have breakthroughs, and then you'll feel like you've gone backwards. You will think that you fully integrated something, and then it will show up again in a new form. You will have days when you feel like you are doing absolutely beautifully, and then days when your shadow is running the whole show and you can barely see straight. It is not a failure when this happens. This is all part of the work. It's part of the practice. Shadow work is not about reaching a finish line. It is building a relationship with yourself, all of yourself. And it gets more honest, more compassionate, and more whole over time. You are not a project that needs to be fixed. You are a human being in the process of becoming. And that process deserves patience. It deserves gentleness. It deserves exactly the kind of compassion that you are learning to extend into your shadow. Okay, now let's go ahead and get into the prompts because I know a lot of you have been waiting for this. The actual tools. So let's go ahead and get into it. I think one of the reasons why shadow work stays abstract for so many people is that they don't have a clear entry point. They know that they should be doing it and they understand the concept, but when they sit down to actually do it, they don't know where to start. So consider this a starting point. I'm going to walk you through several different categories of tools. We're going to do some journaling prompts, mirror work, dialogue work, trigger tracking, rituals, and working with archetypes and tarot. So take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and remember, you don't need to do all of this at once. Even one prompt done with genuine honesty and compassion can crack something wide open for you. So let's start with the most foundational tool. Journaling is one of the most accessible entry points into shadow work because it gives the unconscious a way to speak. When you write without editing yourself or without performing for an audience, things come up that your ordinary thinking keeps tucked away. So here are some prompts to work with, and I encourage you to pick one, just one, and really sit with it. Don't rush to the next one, just let it open up. The first prompt is, what am I afraid people will see in me? The second prompt is, what do I judge most harshly in others? The third prompt is, what parts of myself did I learn were bad, wrong, or too much? The fourth prompt is, what emotions am I most uncomfortable feeling? And the fifth prompt is, what patterns keep repeating in my life? And again, when you are working with these prompts, just be open, honest, raw, and gentle with yourself. Now, mirror work is exactly what it sounds like, working with your own reflection. And I know that that might sound a little bit uncomfortable, and honestly, for most people it is, which is kind of the whole point. This practice is very simple. You sit or stand in front of a mirror, you look into your own eyes, and you speak to yourself, to your shadow, out loud. You might want to say something like, I see you. I know you're there. I'm not running anymore. You might acknowledge a specific shadow aspect like, I see your anger, or I know where you came from, or I'm not afraid of you. You might speak to yourself with compassion that we talked about earlier. You're not broken. You're not too much, or you're allowed to take up space. Try it for just 2 or 3 minutes and see what comes up. Notice what feelings are hard to say. Notice what makes you want to look away. And know that what you resist looking at is often exactly what needs to be seen. Now, this third practice builds on what we were talking about in step 4, actually having a conversation with the shadow aspect. And I want to give you a concrete way to do this because I do think that it is a very powerful tool in shadow work. So here's how it works. You start by identifying a specific shadow aspect that you want to work with. Maybe it's your inner critic. Maybe it's the part of you that has self-sabotage. Maybe it's just anger or fear. Okay, then you're going to open up your journal and I want you to write a dialogue. You're going to write a question from yourself and then let your shadow part answer. You write another question, it answers again. You let it flow without editing or second guessing what comes up. Here are a few questions that you can start with. Who are you? When did you first show up in my life? What are you trying to protect me from? What do you need from me? And what do you want me to know? And then this part is important. You listen. You let the answers come without judging them or dismissing them. You treat this shadow aspect like a real part of you that has something valid to say, because it does. And this practice might feel a little bit strange at first, but just give it a genuine try before you decide that it's not for you. Now, this next thing you can do in real time, this is tracking your triggers. When you get triggered, when something produces that feeling, that charged emotion or reaction that we talked about earlier, instead of just riding the wave or immediately suppressing it, you pause and you ask yourself, what just happened inside of me? Or what does this remind me of? You don't necessarily have to do this in the moment if the moment is too charged. You can always come back to it afterwards. But the key is to notice it and track it. Keeping a trigger journal can also help. Every time that you get significantly triggered, write it down. Write down what happens, how you felt, what story maybe you told yourself. Over time, patterns will emerge, and those patterns will be your guide or your roadmap. And finally, let's talk about some of the tools that I personally love for shadow work. Archetypes and tarot. Now, tarot is one of my absolute favorite tools for shadow work because the cards themselves are essentially a map of the human psyche and archetypes. Every card holds both light and shadow. Every archetype has a high expression and a low expression. And working with the cards in a shadow context means being willing to look at not just the aspirational meaning of a card, but what it might be showing you about what's hidden. Some spreads that work beautifully for shadow work include a simple 3-card pull, asking, what is my shadow showing me right now? What is it trying to protect me from? And what wants to be integrated? You can also work with specific cards as entry points into shadow aspects. For example, the Tower can be for sudden disruption and change and what you are avoiding. The Moon can be for illusion and what's being hidden, or the Devil for the chains that maybe you've put on yourself. Tarot has been a huge part of my own personal shadow work journey, and I highly recommend diving into the deck and using it as a tool. Now, before I close out this section, I do want to say this one more time because it is very important. Shadow work can bring up trauma, real trauma. And if this happens, if you find yourself in a territory that feels too big or too overwhelming, please reach out for professional support. Shadow work done on your own is powerful, but it does have its limits. There's not a spiritual trophy for pushing your way through all of your trauma alone. Getting support is power. It is self-compassion in action, and it's something that we shouldn't be ashamed of. Know your limits, honor them, and keep going at a pace that is sustainable for you. Remember, this is a lifelong practice. There is no rush. Okay, let's take a deep breath. We have been in it today. This is a longer episode. And if you've made it to the end of this episode, I want you to know that this says something about who you are and where you are. It says that you are someone who is genuinely committed to your own growth, someone who is willing to go to that uncomfortable place, and someone who understands that real transformation doesn't happen just on the surface. So let's recap what we covered today because we went deep. Shadow work is not a buzzword. It is real, it is essential, and it is a lifelong practice of bringing the unconscious into consciousness. Your shadow isn't evidence that we are broken. It is evidence that we are humans, that you grew up in a world that asked you to hide parts of yourself in order to survive. The work is to bring them into the light, not to destroy them, not to be ashamed of them, but to understand them, to meet them with compassion, and to gradually and gently reclaim the wholeness that was always yours. Integration is not a destination, it is a direction. You don't arrive at healed, you just keep moving towards more honest, more whole, and more free. Every time you choose to look at your shadow instead of away from it, you are moving in that direction. And the shadow doesn't go away, but your relationship with it changes. It goes from something that can control you to something that you are in conversation with, and that changes everything. So here is your challenge for this week. Just one thing. Go back to the journaling prompts that we talked about and pick one. Just one. Sit with it for 10 or 15 minutes, and without editing yourself, just write. Whatever comes up, let it out. And then be gentle with yourself about what you find. Whatever's in there, whatever the shadow shows you, it developed for a reason. It was protecting you, and it deserves your understanding and not your judgment. Remember, we are not broken, we are not too much, and we are not beyond healing. You are a human being that is doing the incredibly brave work of actually looking at yourself, and that is so powerful. All right, now next week we are going to shift into something that I know many of you have been asking about, and honestly, something that feels like a natural next step after everything that we just talked about today. Because once you start doing shadow work, once you start opening up and going inward, making that contact with parts of yourself that have been hidden, you become a little bit more sensitive. So next week, we are talking about protection and energy clearing. How to protect your energy, cleansing rituals, whether that's with smoke, sound, salt, and more. How to cut cords and release attachments that might be draining you, and how to create a sacred space in your home that actually holds and supports you. It is such a good energy, it's such a good topic, and it pairs perfectly with what we did today. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. I do want to say thank you so much for being here. Thank you for trusting me with your time, your attention, and your inner world. This community, the whole Siren Circle, means so much to me, and I don't take that lightly. If this episode resonated with you, share it with somebody who maybe also wants to hear it or needs to hear it. Leave a review if you haven't already. It really does help more people find this podcast and this work. And come find me over at themagicsiren.com if you want personalized support on your journey. Until next week, be gentle with yourself, keep going, and remember, you are already whole. You're just remembering it. Aloha, and I'll see you next week.